At the end of this week's parsha, oh good, I can run late. At the end of this week's parsha, we have, this week's parsha, obviously, Shmos, it's the beginning of the book of Exodus, of leaving Egypt. So we have the story of, this week's parsha talks about the slavery and oppression of the Jewish people in Egypt at the hands of the Pharaoh and the Egyptian people, etc. At the end of the Torah portion concludes with Moshe Rabbeinu saying to Hashem, Lama harei salam hazeh, why have you made things bad for these people? As a leader of the Jewish people, one would hope that Moshe Rabbeinu would be upset, would be disturbed by the fact that the people that he is supposed to be a leader for, is that those people are having a hard time, they're suffering, they're in terrible pain. One would hope that a leader, or it's integral to the role of being a proper good leader, to be concerned about the welfare, the well-being of the people one is leading. So it makes perfect sense that Moshe Rabbeinu comes to Hashem. These people are suffering, they're in tremendous pain. And so he says, Lo maharei, so why have you made it bad for them? In the beginning of next week's parsha, Parsha's Va'era, Va'era means, and I appeared. Right, Va'era. If we look at the Shoresh, it's Reish Aleph with a Hey there is saw or see. Va'era means, and I appeared. So Hashem says, Va'era, I appeared to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Be'kel Shin Daled Yud. He says by these two names, the names Kel and Shin Daled Yud, which are two of Hashem's name. Ushmi Yud Kei Vav Kei, and my name Yud Kei Vav Kei. Lo nodati lahem. By this name I was not known to them. And he goes on to say, and I told them this was going to happen, and there was going to be this oppression and slavery and this difficult time, and then after this, I'm going to take you out of this oppression and bring you to Har Sinai, to Mount Sinai, to give you the Torah. And he says, V'yadatem ki ani Yud Kei Vav Kei, and you will know that I am Yud Kei Vav Kei, by Matan Torah. How in heaven, first of all, what is Hashem talking about? And what kind of response is this to what Moshe Rabbeinu asked? Moshe Rabbeinu says, why did you make it bad for the Jewish people? And Hashem says, well, because their ancestors only knew me by these names and not this name, and you're going to know me by this name when I take you out of Egypt and take you to Har Sinai. Okay, and point being, what's the connection? So to understand this, we have to talk first about the names of Hashem, the various, why Hashem is known by various names. And to understand properly why Hashem is known by various names, we first have to understand, excuse me, sorry, the function and role of a name. What is a name? What's it there for? And keeping that in mind, why might one have multiple names? And then translating that onto Hashem and understanding why Hashem has multiple names, what the role and function of each of the names is, then maybe we'll get to a point where we can understand what kind of response this is to Moshe's question, Moshe's challenge to Hashem. If we think about what's the primary function of a name is to be able to refer to someone. Let's say there are a couple of functions. One is, when talking about someone in the third person, to be able to refer to the person specifically. If I wanted to tell you, I just had a conversation with a specific person and people didn't have names, how am I telling you who I'm speaking to? And if I want to get someone's attention, this is something I say to my children a lot, because they'll make a request or ask for something as an open question, and if there are, 8 people in the room, 8 people at the table, nobody registers that they're being addressed and that a request is being made of them, and everybody just assumes it's someone else, and then they don't get a response, and then that can be a cause of frustration. One of the things I teach them is, if you're asking a particular person for something, open up the request with their name. Say the name, and then say, can you please pass me this, or do you mind to do this, or can I have that, or whatever it is. And when you address the person by name, that catches their attention, their brain focuses, directs attention towards you, and then when you ask a question, they hear the question. If you don't address them by name, we hear lots of things all the time. People's brains don't necessarily focus on, pay attention to every single sound that's audible. If they did, we'd all be nuts within 30 seconds. So you address someone by name at the opening of the question or response or statement or whatever it is, then you're going to have their attention. They're going to know that you're talking to them. Right? So that's another function of a name, is to be able to address someone. Now, let's take, for example, right? I'll talk about myself as the example, just instead of making up some hypothetical person, and then it gets very vague and difficult to hold attention. Right? If someone were to ask me, what's my name? It's going to depend on the context. If I'm giving a talk, doing a public talk, maybe somewhere for a bunch of adults, I might say Yisroel Glick or Rabbi Yisroel Glick, depending on the dynamic and the environment, etc. If I'm teaching a classroom of younger children, I'll probably just say my name is Rabbi Glick. If I'm meeting a random person on the street and we just strike up a conversation, they ask me my name, I'm probably going to say my name is Yisroel Glick. Right, so in a classroom, young children are going to refer to me as Rabbi Glick. Older students may refer to me as Rabbi Glick or Rabbi Yisroel Glick, or people, let's say, not necessarily students, but people that I'll speak to in a public setting might refer to me as Rabbi Yisroel Glick. My children call me Tati. Acquaintances, sorry? I'm getting there. Acquaintances, current acquaintances call me Yisroel. Acquaintances from, my youth call me Struli, because that's what I was known as when I was a kid. That's the name that I was known by. I think that'll do. That's enough. Now,
and your mom?
Sorry?
And your mom?
My parents call me Srolik, because I'm named after the Baal Shem Tov, and that's the way that the Baal Shem Tov was referred to as a child. So, now, I have different names. I'm referred to by different names in different environments. I also behave differently in different environments. The persona that I present when I'm teaching young children, if I'm teaching in a classroom for high school children, the persona that I present is going to be very different to the persona that I present if I'm speaking for a community of adults, both of which are going to be different to the way that I present if I'm speaking to a friend, all of which are going to be different to the way that I present if I'm interacting with my children. Right, so I have multiple personas. I have the Rabbi Glick persona, the Rabbi Yisroel Glick persona, I have Yisrael persona and the Struli persona, and I have the Tati persona and the Srolik persona when I'm talking to my parents. So, am I just like this, what's the word I'm looking for? Am I a con artist? I have like all these different personas, and depending on who I'm interacting with, I behave differently and present a different persona. I mean, that is a skill that con artists probably tend to be very good at, the successful and effective con artists. But that's not called being a con artist, that's called behaving appropriately. If I behaved exactly the same way and presented the exact same persona when interacting with adults who I'm speaking to as when I'm interacting with classmates who I was in school with, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, and I behave the same way as both of those when I'm interacting with my children at home, something's wrong. Right? I'm not behaving appropriately in at least some of those environments, possibly all of them. Right? It's appropriate and correct and productive and healthy to present different personas in different environments. So then the question is, which one's the real me? Is Rabbi Yisroel Glick the real me and the other ones are just a persona? Is Rabbi Glick the real me? Is Yisrael the real me? Is Struli the real me? Is Tati the real me? Which one am I actually, and then which ones are personas? And the answer is, none of them are the real. It depends what you mean by real. Are they real personas? Yes. Am I faking? I hope not too much. But none of them are me, who I am. Right? Every one of us is an individual that cannot be defined or described by a persona, and cannot have a specific persona as defining who they are, because we are not our persona. As evidence in the words, my persona, your persona, his persona, her persona, means a persona of that person, which means there's the person and then there's the persona that they have. You would even say your body, right? That means that you are not your body. You are an entity that inhabits a body. The body is the body that belongs to you, that you inhabit. Right, so who we are, right, our actual identity is something that's very difficult to describe, to articulate. Ultimately, who we are, if we dig all the way down, the truest identity of every single one of us is an instance of a spark of divinity, a spark of the Creator. That's who and what every single one of us is. Now, if we all have a spark of the Creator, why do we not all have the same personality? Because there's our ultimate absolute identity, right? When we say ultimate identity, what does the word ultimate actually mean? Ultimate means last or final, right? Penultimate means second last. That's not a word that most people use very frequently, but that's what it means. Ultimate means last or final. So when you say it's the person's ultimate identity, why is that the last identity? Maybe it should be the first one. Well, it's like, it is the first one in a sense, but in discovery, it's the last one. Because you say, well, you know, what's this person's identity? And we might talk about their personality. And you'll say, well, that's not really their identity. That's a personality. Can we dig a little bit deeper, dig a little bit deeper, dig a little bit deeper? Ultimately, finally, there's a point at which we get to an identity that you can't go any deeper. There is no deeper to go. It's the ultimate identity. It's the last one you get to. There's no further to go. That's the ultimate identity. So when we say ultimate, we mean the truest, the most absolute, because it's the last one you'll get to when you're digging. Now, assuming that I present an appropriate persona in each of these environments, when I'm speaking to adults at a public talk or whatever it is, I'm presenting myself honestly, I'm speaking honestly, I'm presenting myself honestly in a way that is appropriate for the crowd that I'm interacting with. When I'm teaching high school students, I'm presenting myself honestly, as appropriately as I can for the crowd, for the people I'm interacting with. When I behave with my children, I'm presenting myself honestly in a way that's appropriate for the people I'm interacting with, etc., etc., etc. So they are different personas or different ways of presenting myself, all of which are honest and true. None of them are a misrepresentation or a scam, because none of them is any more true as defining me than any of the others. None of them define me. No person is defined by any of their personas. A persona, a character, is something that a person presents. Now, can a person present a persona that's fake, that's an act? Absolutely, yes. That's a very real thing. But that doesn't mean that if I present myself in different ways, I'm scamming or lying or being dishonest. Now, each of those personas that I have, each of those, let's say, modes of behavior has a specific name that's associated with it. Right? If I'm walking up Kingston Avenue on the way to 770 for shul on Friday night, and I hear someone call out from behind me, and I hear them say, "Oh, good Shabbos, Rabbi Glick," or I hear someone say, "Good Shabbos, Yisroel," before I even have the time to process and think, oh, okay, what name did they call me? What context do I know them in? Or before I have time to stop and think, hang on, do I recognize that voice? Who is that? I'm going to turn around and respond and say, Good Shabbos. I'm already turning around. If they said Rabbi Glick, I'm already turning around in teacher mode. If they say Good Shabbos Yisrael, I'm already turning around in friend contemporary mode, because the name Yisrael is associated with that persona. So when someone calls out to me by that name, it automatically, because it's associated with that persona, it automatically elicits that persona, and that's the persona with which I respond. Not because I stop and ask myself, okay, hang on a second, what did they call me? What's the appropriate way to respond? Or because I'm saying, okay, who is this person? What's the appropriate way to respond? It happens automatically because the name is associated with the persona. You know, when I hear someone, if I'm walking up the street and I hear someone say, "Hi, Tati," I don't have to stop and say to myself, hang on a second, okay, they call me Tati, it's got to be one of my kids. Oh, let me turn around and say hi. Right? It happens automatically. And not just because I do the processing faster, but because the name Tati is associated with the persona of father, and the name automatically elicits that persona, and that's the way I respond. Right? So different names are associated with different personas. The same exact thing is true of Hashem. As difficult as it is to define a person's identity, the actual true absolute identity of a person, of an individual, it's infinitely more impossible to define the true identity of Hashem in a way that's absolutely correct. The closest thing we can say about Hashem is that Hashem is absolutely infinite. Now, absolutely infinite doesn't mean Hashem is infinitely large. It's true that Hashem is infinitely large, let's say. That's a quantitative measurement, a measurement of quantity, of how big Hashem is. But also qualitatively, in terms of qualities, characteristics, Hashem is infinite. There is nothing that you cannot say about Hashem. Yeah, that's going to get messy and complex. So let's put that on hold. But there's an expression that it's written in a very old sefer called Avodas HaKodesh, a very, very old sefer of Kabbalah. And it says, Kutsha brichol shleimus adokula. Hashem is absolutely infinite. What do I mean by absolutely infinite? What would be an infinity that's not absolutely infinite? I'm going to draw a graph. Right, if I draw a graph, technically speaking, if I draw a graph that looks like that, it starts here and it ends here. Most of the time when people draw a graph like that, what they mean is that it's going to continue. But the technically correct way to illustrate that on the graph is to put an arrow at the end, right? Which indicates that this line continues for infinity. So where does this line go to? Until infinity. It doesn't stop anywhere, right? That's infinity because it's infinite. The reason we have this symbol is because this rule or this trend applies to every single number that exists. If you, let's say, right now this doesn't exactly work. Let's say this is a graph of, in order to make it work, let's say y equals x minus 1. That's the formula that is being illustrated by this. And it would technically have to go down that way also, unless we define the domain. So if we have that, this rule is true. It doesn't matter what you plug in for x. If you put in x as a billion or a gazillion or a trillion or negative a trillion, it's going to work. And you can go larger. Why is it that this graph, you have to put the arrows and it's infinite? Because this graph applies to every number. And the set of numbers is infinite. There are infinite possible numbers. So I'm going to make a statement. Is the set of numbers, or a question, is it true that the set of numbers is infinite? Why not? Yes, depending on how you on what you mean by infinite. Right? If I say, is the set of numbers absolutely infinite? The answer is absolutely not. It's infinite in the context of how large it is, of quantity, of magnitude. But the set of numbers doesn't include bricks. It doesn't include ideas. It doesn't include tomatoes. They're not included in the set of numbers. So the set of numbers is not infinite. It's quantitatively infinite. In terms of quantity, it's infinite. It's not absolutely infinite. It's infinite in a specific context. In the context of how large it is, it's infinite. It's not absolutely infinite. There's lots that's not included in it. Right? The only entity that is absolutely infinite is Hashem. Now, the extent to which Hashem is, the extent of the infinity of Hashem, when we say absolutely infinite, is articulated in the Sefer Avodas HaKodesh, and it says Hashem is shleimus dekula, absolutely infinite. And it continues and says that just like Hashem sheyesh lo koach v'bilti bal, just like Hashem has the capacity for infinity, has infinite capacity, Hashem also has the capacity for limitation and finitude. And it continues, it says, For if you define Hashem as being only infinite and not having the capacity for limitation, that is a limitation, and then Hashem is not absolutely infinite. Hashem is infinite in that direction, but Hashem is very, very finite qualitatively. If we say that Hashem is so infinite, he has to be infinite and cannot be finite or apply limitation. It's the opposite of infinite, limitation. So, right, Hashem is absolute infinity. That's the least imprecise way that we could define the identity of Hashem, let's say, perhaps.
What is finite?
Finite means limited. You know what infinite is?
Yeah.
So infinite means infinite, not finite. So it's the opposite. It's limited, has a limitation or definition. So there is no... Now, is it true that Hashem is kind? What does it mean when you say that a person's kind? It could mean multiple things, right? One person, you'll say that they're kind, and what you mean is this person exhibits kindness. They behave in a way that is kind. Someone else, you might mean this person is very kind in terms of their disposition, the way that they treat, or the way that they perceive people, and the way that they feel towards people. But no person is defined as kindness is what the person is. They're not kindness, they're a human being. A human being who has a trait or characteristic of kindness. And there can be variations of that. It could be emotional, it could be behavioral, etc. But kind is not who or what the person is. It's something that they exhibit. And this is true of everything. Is Hashem kind? Does Hashem exhibit kindness? Absolutely. And strength and stringency and severity and all the different things that we know about Hashem are true. Hashem exhibits these behaviors. These are personas with which Hashem presents. Because in order to interact with the world, there need to be defining characteristics. There needs to be some kindness, some outgoingness, some restriction, some limitation, etc., etc., etc. Right? If a person had no personality, and by no personality, I don't mean, sometimes someone might say, oh my goodness, this person has no personality. What they mean is this person's personality is bland, perhaps. It doesn't mean they don't have a personality, they do, and that is their personality. So there's no such thing as a person without a personality. A person, by definition, has to have a personality because a personality is the definition of how we perceive and interact with our surroundings. And there is a way that we do that, which means we have a personality. A person's personality might be very flexible and undefined, if maybe it's very unspecific, but it's not that they don't have a personality, it's that that is their personality. There's no such thing as a person without a personality. For the universe to be brought into being from the absolute infinity of Hashem, there need to be personas, behavioral modes, different ways through which Hashem brings the universe into being, through which Hashem interacts with the world. And these are what we refer to as kindness and stringency, chesed and gvor, etc., 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 all of these things. Truth and honesty and severity, all of these things are true. But none of them are what Hashem is. These are different personas or behavioral modes that Hashem employs in order to do what he wants to do. And the same way that a person who has multiple personas might have different names that refer to and elicit and awaken and call upon different personas, the same is true of Hashem. Right? So, and in Pnimiyas HaTorah, in Chassidus and Kabbalah, we talk a lot about this name of Hashem refers to this or is associated with this midah, and this name is associated with this midah. What that means is, right, and you'll see sometimes in that there are some like Sephardic, Kabbalistic Sidurim where, every time it says Hashem's name, inside the name or in brackets or, there are different layouts, it'll have like some interesting, obscure, what doesn't seem to be exactly a spelling of Hashem's name. And what it is these are different Kabbalistic permutations of Hashem's name, each of which is associated with a different specific spiritual persona or behavioral mode of Hashem. And those are never pronounced. God forbid a person pronounces Hashem the same way, Hashem's name the same way every time, but a person could have in mind different variations of the name in different parts of davening, different parts of prayer, in order to call upon different specific personas of Hashem that are associated with what they want, what they're asking for, what they're praising, whatever it is.
Is that how they're written in the original? Or like where it's sourced
The original
from?
Siddur?
Like where do they pull those names from?
I mean, it's discussed in Kabbalah, all the different variations of the names and things, different spellings, etc. So, these are the functions of names, and this is why Hashem has multiple names, the same way that probably everybody has multiple names to some degree. Now, let's talk a little bit about the names. Right, so he says, Hashem's response to Moshe is, Va'era el Avram el Yitzchak el Yaakov, Bekel Shin Daled Yud. He says, when I appeared to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, when I interacted with them, when I had a relationship with them, an interactive relationship with them, when they experienced me in an interaction, which of my personas was presented, or the personas known by which names? Kel and Shin Daled Yud. Right? Which are closely associated. Let's focus on this one, Shin Daled Yud.
Could you write out the pasuk that you used?
Va'era el Avram el Yitzchak el Yaakov. He says, and I appeared to Avram, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov, Bekel Shin Daled Yud, with the names Kel and Shin Daled Yud, Ushmi Yud Kei Vav Kei Lo Nodati Lahem. And it's the very, very beginning of next week's parsha. And by the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, I was not known to them. So the question is, obviously, in order to understand this, now that we have a concept of what names are, so these ones, yes, and Yud Kei Vav Kei, right? This is for Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They were known by these names and not by this name. So let's have a look at the names, and you'll see this, that the actual composition and structure of the names represents figuratively the persona that they're associated with. Or the translation, the spelling, all of the above. Different ones that are specified and elaborated on in different situations. So if we take the name Shin Daled Yud, right? The letters Daled and Yud, Dai, means enough. So the name Shin Daled Yud means I am Hashem She Dai, who is sufficiently great, capable, powerful to create, to bring reality into being. Right, now that's very specific. If we ask, well, what extent of infinity or how large or infinite is the persona that's associated with the name Shin Daled Yud? Well, it's actually very limited, right? In order to bring existence into being as we know it, there had to be a lot of limitation, a lot of reduction, a lot of measurement. And the name Shin Daled Yud is very specific. This is Hashem as he's presenting himself specifically in the capacity that is sufficiently great to bring the reality that we know into being, and not greater. Very limited, right? This is going to be associated also with the name Elohim. If we look in the account in Parshas Bereshis, the beginning, Genesis means creation, of the account of Hashem bringing reality into being, it says, Bereshis bara Elohim es hashamayim es haaretz. Elohim, 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 Elohim. It doesn't use the word Yud Kei Vav Kei. It uses the word name Elohim every time, because Elohim is similar. That's the name that's associated with this limiting persona of Hashem's, which is employed when Hashem is reducing to create something that's limited relative to the infinity of Hashem. So that's this name, a similar thing, Shaddai. It's enough, it's sufficient for the job at hand, not more. Right? I mean, if someone asks you to do a job and they're like, I want you to, please, do the job properly, get the job done. Or, let me word it a bit differently. Someone asks you to do a job, maybe they hire you, or it's a favor, whatever it is, and they say, listen, this job is really, really important to me, really, please, take care of it well. And you might respond and say, well, okay, how much effort should I put into it? Right, and a perhaps appropriate response might be something like, enough. Maybe a little bit more specific might be, enough to make sure it's done really, really well. And it's like, well, how much is that? It's like, well, I didn't give you an amount because I don't care how much it is. There's an objective. I want you to achieve the objective. Put in sufficient effort to achieve the objective. The objective is what determines how much effort you put in. I don't care if you spend 1 hour. I don't care if you spend 1,000 hours. Get the job done well. However much effort you have to put in to get the job done well, that's how much effort you need to put in. Right? So that's the answer. It's enough. Similar thing here. Hashem presents as sufficiently infinite to achieve creation, no more, no less. How much is it? How much it actually is irrelevant. What's important is that it's sufficient to produce existence, to create, which is obviously very, very limited and finite relative to Hashem himself. Now, let's take a look at the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. We have in here, this name, the letters, enough letters to spell every letter that's required to spell the word Haya, which means was, Hove, is, and Yihiyeh, will be. Right? Every letter that's required for all of these are all jumbled up and included in this name together. What does that represent? Where did this table come from? Ultimately, right? Came from a tree, blah, blah, probably. Is it wood? I think it's wood that's covered in plastic. So it came partly from a tree, partly from a lab, all of it from a factory. If we go back fast enough, well, where did the wood come from? From a tree. Where did the tree come from? It grew out of the earth as stimulated by a seed that landed there, or a sapling, whatever it is. If we trace it back far enough, ultimately everything came from Hashem. Right? Everything exists because Hashem makes it exist. That's not just true of physical objects. It's true of concepts. It's true of ideas. It's true of phenomena. And it's true of time, and it's true of space. Space is a creation. Time is a creation. So, this desk, it's the original, the origin of this desk is the absolute infinity of Hashem, right? Going back to what we said about how infinite Hashem is, if Hashem is absolutely infinite, obviously the being of Hashem contains within it the desk. Because if it didn't, then Hashem would be infinity minus the desk. If Hashem is absolutely infinite, everything is included within that infinity of Hashem, and Hashem is bringing it into being from within himself. It's true of the desk, it's true of mass and energy themselves, it's true of space, and it's true of time. Time collectively originally exists within Hashem. And that's true specifically of every moment in time. Every single moment of time is a creation that was brought into being by Hashem from within the absolute infinity of Hashem. So in Hashem himself, the way Hashem is, not the way Hashem presents for creation by limiting and defining a specific characteristic. The way Hashem just is for himself, right? He's just being. Everything is included together. Time, space, every point in space, every point in time. So in Hashem, there is the past, the present, and the future all combined together. That's all just included together equally within the infinity of Hashem. So what this name refers to is not Hashem as limiting and presenting in a way that's sufficient and appropriate for creation. It's Hashem as Hashem is for himself. As a result of which, by definition, the past, the present, and the future all automatically are included together. And so that's what the name is telling us. It represents that. It illustrates that for us. The same way that this name says, no, here we just have sufficient for creation, which would be time as it exists as we know it. Every moment in time existing individually, specifically defined in a specific order, etc. Because that's what is sufficient for creation. This is just Hashem himself. Everything's included together. And so Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, I appeared to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Yes, amazing. They had, it was an amazing thing that they got to speak to Hashem and interact with the Creator. But Hashem says, I only interacted with them with the name Kel Shin Daled Yud. The level of divinity that they interacted with was only Hashem as already limited, reduced, measured, calculated to be sufficient for creation. Shmi Yud Kei Vav Kei, the way I am for myself beyond all of that, where every moment in time exists equally, simultaneously, because it's just all part of the absolute infinity of Hashem. Shmi Yud Kei Vav Kei lo nadati lahem. They never got even close to that. And Hashem says, but I'm going to take you out of Egypt. I'm going to bring you to Har Sinai and give you the Torah. V'yedatem ki ani Yud Kei Vav Kei, and then you are going to know me as Yud Kei Vav Kei. Right? Because the world is created by and associated with these names, Kel and Shin Daled Yud. And the way that Hashem is going to interact with people, even in a way that's not necessarily natural, but if it's happening within the world in general, it's still going to be associated with the personas that are associated with these names, that are associated with the world and creation. When Hashem gave the Torah, what happened? Right? The first word of the Aseret HaDibros is Anochi, I. Why doesn't it say Ani? Anochi is a very unusual word. It's not the standard Hebrew word for I, which is Ani. Why does it say Anochi? Because this is an acronym, Rosh Hashanah for Ana, in Aramaic means I, Nafshi, Ksavis, Yehavis. Now, this comes from the En Yaakov. And in En Yaakov, what it means, the pshat of what it means is Hashem is saying, Ana Nafshi, I myself, Ksavis, wrote this, Yehavis, and gave it to you. Hashem is saying, like, this Torah is from me directly. I gave it to you. And Chassidus gives a similar but slightly different, subtly different, well, it's more than subtle, interpretation of this. And actually the Chassidus' interpretation is more literal to the translation of the words, which is Hashem saying, Ana, I, Nafshi, my soul, my true self, Ksavis, have written into these words, Yehavis, and presented to you. That's what happened when Hashem gave the Torah. Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov learnt the Torah. The Jews in Mitzrayim learnt Torah. Yaakov sent Yehuda ahead to set up yeshiva so they could learn. They were learning Torah. They did the mitzvahs, but they didn't have access to Yud Kei Vav Kei even through Torah and mitzvahs, because that is something that Hashem presented and made possible when He gave the Torah actively at Har Sinai. That's why the Aseret HaDibros at Har Sinai starts with the word Anochi, Ano Nafshi Ksavis Yehavis. Before that, Torah was accessible to them, but Hashem hadn't activated it as a vehicle for interacting with the absolute and it says Anochi Hashem Elekecha, Anochi Yud Kei Vav Kei Elekecha. Hashem says Anochi Yud Kei Vav Kei, I as I am for myself, before any limitations or reductions or calculations or measurements, where time, all of time and space and everything else is all equally included in this absolute infinity, that I, Hashem Elekecha, am the same Hashem and being presented to you in the natural world that's associated with Elokim and Yud Kei Vav Kei, with Elokim and Kel and Shin Daled Yud, etc. That's what Matan Torah is going to be, Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu. When you get to Har Sinai, what you're going to have is a whole different, completely different thing to what they had. And not just the Torah and mitzvahs, the prophecy, when they conversed, when Avraham Avinu had dialogue with Hashem, it was a completely different thing. Right? If someone is having a dialogue with a little kid versus having a dialogue with a college professor versus having a dialogue with their spouse, those are going to be, hopefully, three very, very different dialogues. It's in a sense, it's actually a different person who's speaking. In a sense, it's a completely different persona. The essence, the ultimate identity is the same, but it's almost a different person. And that's what Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu. Yes, they had prophecy, they had dialogue with me, but that was Kel Shin Daled Yud Kei Vav Kei, that was never in the conversation before. It's not actually possible for that to enter into the world, even supernaturally, until Matan Torah. Okay, how's that a response to Moshe Rabbeinu's issue? It's a response because this is an immense change. Right now, let's talk about the word work for a second. If I ask you, what does work mean? Right, there might be multiple different responses. It means, it's what someone does for their job, or maybe it's when you do something difficult. All of those are valid interpretations of the word work. If you look at the word work in a very technical sense, as a technical term in physics, work describes a change being made, something happening. Right? So if I move this from here to here, you can calculate what is the work that happened, which is going to involve the mass of this and the force of gravity and how much distance it moved and how much force had to be put in. Now, then you can say how many calories, how much energy was required to do that work. Two different questions, right? Work is a change that happens. The amount of change is technically the work that happens. Now, someone might say, I worked really hard to do that. If you ask a one-year-old kid to move this from here to here, they're going to say, oh, I worked so hard to do that. Or you might say to them, you're working really hard to do that. I'm so proud of you, whatever. That's not really what work means as a technical term in physics. Work refers to the change that happened, and then there's what you did to make it happen. And the amount of energy that you spend is measured in calories, in joules. A change cannot be made without energy being invested, because if the energy is not spent, everything is going to stay exactly where it is. Or it might not stay where it is. If something's flying through space, it's going to continue flying through space at exactly the same rate in exactly the same direction until a force is applied to it to change that, right? If it comes within the field of gravitational pull of a body, of a planet, of a moon, or whatever star, whatever it is, then that gravity is going to pull it towards it. It's going to change course. Why? Because the force of gravity is applied and makes it change. Right? Nothing is going to change unless there is a force applied to make it change. The change from interacting with Kel Shin Daled Yud to interacting with Yud K Vav K is enormous. Now, I'm not saying that these are comparable, but let's say that someone, works on their fitness and they do exercise every day and they go for a walk or a bike ride or whatever it is, and they do resistance training and, they're quite fit. They're much fitter than your average person, let's say. If you give this person a challenge and say, I want you to be able to make it to the top of Mount Everest, the cardiovascular fitness you need to survive at that altitude, to make it all the way up, etc., is immense. And this person's so let's say someone comes to you and says, I want you to be able to climb Mount Everest by the end of the year. Right? Some people's response is going to be like, are you crazy? I could never do that. Or maybe it's too dangerous. I don't want to do that. But let's say the person's interested. It's like, I can't do that. It's like, okay, well, do exercise, get fit. And a person might say, I don't have the time or the effort or the interest to put in that much work. What do you mean that much work? Who says it has to be that much work? The answer is very simple. The difference between where I am now, the reality as it is, and the reality that you're describing as a goal, as an objective, the difference between them is enormous. And the amount of effort that has to be invested to achieve a certain amount of work, or in less technical terms, you could say the amount of work you have to put in to achieve a certain amount of change or progress or growth is proportional. You want double the growth, you have to, maybe it's not linear, but the more growth you want to achieve, the more work you have to do. The more work you want to achieve, the more effort you have to put in. It's very simple. Tremendous change requires tremendous effort. So Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, right now, that level of effort, I would expect that probably most people, I would think genetically, have the capacity to be able to do something like that if they are sufficiently motivated and dedicated. Most people are never going to achieve the necessary level of fitness. Why? Because the amount of work it takes is ridiculous, and most people are just not interested. Right? Because it's an enormous amount of work. Why aren't people interested in putting in that amount of work? Because putting in that amount of work takes effort. It involves a lot of discomfort. Becoming stronger involves discomfort, hard work, things that you'd rather not be doing if you had the choice, right? Enormous progress requires discomfort by definition. It requires hard work. Hard work is not fun. Hard work is not comfortable. If a person wants to make enormous progress, enormous change, by definition, it necessarily requires discomfort. It necessarily requires doing things one would not choose to do if they had the choice, if there was no reason compelling them to do it. Always, any massive change or growth or development is going to require that. Now, there are some things that are, in order for a person to have to achieve them, it's going to be, right, and here let's talk about the difference between discomfort and pain. Right? a person might say, oh my goodness, that was painful. And you will say, what happened? Like, is it okay? Do you need like some medication, some pain management? Like, no, not actually literally painful. It was just like extremely uncomfortable. And I'm exaggerating and saying it was painful, right? Pain and discomfort are not the same thing. They're perhaps in a sense similar, and one's the same sort of thing at a different scale or different level of scale. They're both, let's call it more or less loosely, negative emotion or negative sensation. Tremendous progress requires a preparedness to experience discomfort. It may not necessarily require pain. It may not necessarily require something that you would say is bad. Right, and what might be the difference between the person who says, yeah, I'll take the challenge to climb Mount Everest, and the person who says, I won't? One of those people looks at it and is like, well, that's going to be way too uncomfortable or undesirable or unpleasant or painful to justify it. I'm not interested. And the other person, for whatever reason, maybe they have stronger genetics, they've already done most of the work, they're not so far away, or they kind of enjoy the discomfort of that hard work, which means it's not actually uncomfortable for them, it's pleasant to them. That person's going to say yes. Right? So, is there discomfort? Yes. One of these people says this discomfort to me is categorized as negative to the degree that I will choose against it. The other person says there's some discomfort, doesn't bother me, or I'm sufficiently motivated by the objective. Yes, I will do it. Moshe Rabbeinu asked Hashem a question. So Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, guys, like, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were way greater than almost everyone who's in Egypt right now. Way greater. And even they only ever got to Kel Shin Daled Yud. Hashem says, I'm taking you to Har Sinai. You're going to get the Torah, V'yadatim ki ani Yud Kei Vav Kei. You are going to know not Hashem's persona as presented to be just sufficient for creation. You're going to know Hashem as Hashem is for himself. Where everything, time, space, mass, energy, every point in time, every point in space, all of it is just included together by definition in the absolute infinity of Hashem, which is why that's referred to with Yud Kei Vav Kei, Haya Haya, was, is, will be, all included together. You guys are going to come to Har Sinai and you're going to have a dialogue with that level of divinity. I mean, the amount of progress that we're talking about here is orders of magnitude would be the understatement of the year. We're talking about interacting with Hashem as designed or as presented just enough to create a physical reality, which relative to Hashem as Hashem is for himself is nothing, versus Hashem as Hashem is for himself. That kind of transition, to make that kind of achievement, that kind of growth, you want to get there, that requires immense work, immense difficulty, immense challenge, immense discomfort. There's no way to make that sort of transition without being prepared to have discomfort and, unpleasantness, etc. So thank you so much. Did Moshe not understand this? Yeah, Moshe understood this. Moshe's question, notice, Moshe didn't say, why did you make it difficult for them? That wasn't his question. And in Moshe's question, we have an incredible lesson. Moshe's question to Hashem was, I know all of that, but why did you make it bad? Bad is going to be difficult, but difficult doesn't necessarily equal bad. Moshe Rabbeinu says, I know there has to be growth. I know there has to be tremendous growth. And we have to be prepared to work hard and to experience the discomfort of doing things beyond our comfort zone and all this. I get it. But why did you make it bad? Right? And the insight here to us is, if we want to get somewhere in life, if we want to make anything close to the impact on the world that we are here to make, if we want to become anything that is even in the ballpark of resembling who we were created to be and who we could be, and create a legacy and a contribution to the world that's anything close to resembling the legacy that we have the potential to create, it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take discomfort. The thing is that everything that's bad is uncomfortable. Everything that's painful is uncomfortable. Not everything that's uncomfortable has to be bad or has to be painful. And in his question, Moshe Rabbeinu is telling us, if you want to get somewhere in life, it's going to involve discomfort. Grow up. You want to make something of yourself? You have to embrace discomfort. You want to achieve something? You have to embrace discomfort. But Moshe Rabbeinu is telling us, if you embrace the discomfort yourself, in a sense, you have the chance to do it on your own terms, and you might be able to avoid it being painful. Right? Sometimes Hashem might, let's say a person goes through tragedy. Tragedy very often can be a point of growth for some people, of tremendous spiritual growth and personal development. Why? Because tragedy is painful, it's difficult, and that difficulty can often be associated with progress. It doesn't mean that a person has to experience tragedy and pain and suffering to make the progress. Some people just put in the work to make the progress without the tragedy there to motivate them. Does it involve discomfort? Yes. But it doesn't have to be painful. It doesn't have to hurt. It doesn't have to be bad. And so Moshe Rabbeinu in this question is in a sense speaking to us and saying, if you want your life to become something, to achieve something, to be made into something, yes, you're going to have to experience discomfort. If you sit around and wait for Hashem to motivate you, and for Hashem to push you into that discomfort, you might not like where it goes. You might not like the variety of discomfort. The discomfort might be bad. It might be painful. But discomfort doesn't necessarily have to be painful or bad per se, necessarily. So embrace the discomfort. Say, I want to make something of my life. I want to get somewhere. I know that doing so will involve discomfort. Let me embrace this discomfort and say, I'm prepared to be uncomfortable. I'm prepared to experience things that are unpleasant that I wouldn't choose to if there wasn't sufficient motivation to do so. I'm going to embrace them. I'm going to engage. I'm going to do those things. And when we do that, we are already seeing to the fact that we are putting in the necessary effort. And because we are choosing when and how to put in that effort, we're choosing to embrace the discomfort in the way that we're embracing it. That just might be a way to avoid Hashem pushing us into that discomfort. And if Hashem pushes us into the discomfort, it might be the kind that's bad, that Moshe Rabbeinu, that the Jewish people had in Egypt. They had tremendous suffering. They had experienced tremendous discomfort. Discomfort is necessary for growth, but it doesn't have to be bad. And that's the opportunity that we have, is to embrace discomfort and challenge and difficulty in a way that is uncomfortable and difficult and challenging, but is not bad, it's not painful. And it's very, very, very possible that in doing so we will actually be avoiding things that will be bad, things that will be painful, because we're already embracing the discomfort. Hashem doesn't have to push us into it.